Good evening and welcome to the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Tonight we open a two-day conference, Navigating the Past, Shaping the Future, Middle Eastern Discourse on Jews in Israel Before and After October 7th. I'd like to emphasize the main program will be tomorrow in Hebrew and will be in here all day long. So please, you're warmly welcome to join us for the continuation of the conference tomorrow. My name is Brendan Friedman. I'm a senior researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Let me briefly introduce three speakers who are going to give our welcoming and opening remarks. First, Professor Eyal Zisser, the Vice Rector of Tel Aviv University. Next, Dr. Amos Nadan, the Executive Director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. And Professor Uriya Shavit, the Director of the Irwin Cotler Institute. Professor Zisser, please.
Yes, well, good afternoon, actually good evening. I do believe that this conference, this event is one of the most important or significant events we are holding this week as part of the meeting of the Board of Governors of Tel Aviv University. It is important, it is significant because it does addresses one of the main challenges Israel is facing today, a challenge to the Israeli society, a challenge to the state of Israel, a challenge to the Jewish people here and in the diaspora. It is also important because when we ask ourselves, and there are so many experts for Middle Eastern affairs in this room, and usually we are good in providing forecasts for the future. The common question we are being asked is, what is going to happen? Ma yeh? And usually we have an answer. But since 7 October, I do afraid that it's very difficult, it's very hard to provide an answer as for future, as for the way Israel should meet the challenges it is facing. And I do believe that part of the answer, or a main important answer to the question, is to continue our normal life, to continue building, developing the state, the society, educating new generation of students, scholars, of citizens here in Israel, continue promoting our relations with the Arab world, and it is important. This is the full half glass part of the glass. That none of the Arab countries that signed peace agreements with us broke this agreement, or disengage, or cut its diplomatic relations with Israel. And this is a proof that once we overcome the immediate challenge, there might be a prospect for promoting or restarting the peace process and the process of normalization with our Arab neighbors. And this is all what this conference is about. Part of our effort to continue in our normal life, in continuing educating a new generation of scholars, and part of the effort to understand and assess our relations with the Arab world, which might be proven as an important challenge we will have to face in the coming future. So thank you very much for coming here this evening, and I wish you, well, I can't say we enjoy what we are discussing right now, but I wish we a successful event. So thank you.
Thank you, Eyal, and thank you everyone for coming. It's we are very honored to have here also people from the Board of Governance of the university, Ricky and other friends that are coming and also support the Dayan Center. I think that in kind of 3 to 4 minutes that I will ask to speak, I would speak about what we do here at the Dayan Center, and it's related also to the event of 7th October and the war after that. I think it's clear to everyone, and the title of the conference that we have here is around anti-Semitism, and we see that it increased significantly since 7th of October. We speak in academic terms about BDS, and of course about intimidations that many of us experience. I can tell you on a personal level, I was in San Diego with about 40 policemen just securing my talk because it was a talk by an Israeli expert in Middle Eastern studies. So what we try to do in Dayan Center, and in fact we do that for many years, is to make sure that most of us, our historians, know to do one specific thing: to analyze processes from the past and to continue while analyzing the same processes in the current era, and also speaking about the future. And this gives significant differences to regular analysis that you're familiar with in non-Dayan-like institutions. And I think that what we learned from 7th of October is that we didn't speak loud enough to say what we understand. And just kind of to give you a taste of that, here in the room you have people that said before 7th October that the war is about to occur. And nobody really believed them. And here in the room from the Dayan Center, we have an expert that said that Hamas' prime target is to murder Jews. And even myself, I was saying that economic sanctions didn't work through the history and are not going to work, as I assessed, in the case of Iraq, in Iran, and in the case of Hamas. What I'm saying is that we have to bring history back to the discussion, first of all, which is also to the wide audience, but more than that, and this is something that we aim to do at the Dayan Center, is to bringing also to decision makers. And one of the our effort in the coming year or so would be, in fact, to make sure that knowledge from the Dayan Center is being spread to the right places. As we said, never again, so now it's time for never again. Thank you. Uriya.
Thank you, Amos, for bringing this event together. I will not take a lot of your time because we're already in somewhat of a delay. Just one thing. There's been a debate since October 7th as to whether Hamas is a Nazi organization, neo-Nazi, and so forth. Well, here's the thing. There is no Nazism without anti-Semitism. The two cannot be separated. Anti-Semitism doesn't define Hamas, and doesn't define the contemporary Arab discourse as such, but it became an inseparable part of it. That's an important distinction. That is, even if you root out anti-Semitism from the Islamist discourse, where it is very dominant, they still want to kill each and every Jew who lives in the state of Israel, and possibly beyond it, which in a way makes the challenge that this important conference, seminar deals with even more important. So I'm very happy for the cooperation between the Dayan Center and the Erwin Cotler Institute. I say Erwin Cotler, but Erwin Cotler is actually with us here. I don't know if they can see you, Erwin. Maybe you want to... Yeah, and I'm not sure that everyone who sits here knows just how much behind the scenes Erwin is doing these days for the state of Israel. So just take my word for it. It's a lot. I very much regret that I cannot stay because I have a class to teach. I don't know if Eyal can. I think you probably also can. So Amos, we leave you in charge. And good luck to you all, and thank you again for this.
Thank you very much, Professor Shavit and Professor Zisser and Dr. Nadan. It's a pleasure to open the first panel titled Antisemitism Before and After October 7, an Assault on Human Rights. Professor Cotler was already mentioned, that it's a pleasure to introduce you, somebody who I consider also a mentor. And aside of the work and the contemporary work of the center here at Tel Aviv University, Professor Cotler is the international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's an emeritus professor at McGill University. He's a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, longtime member of Parliament, also in Canada, and the first special envoy on the prevention of anti-Semitism and Holocaust remembrance. Professor Cotler is a constitutional lawyer, a legal scholar, and the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles. He has written upon the landmark charter of rights cases in areas of free speech or freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and crime and justice. As Minister of Justice and also as Attorney General, he's been initiated the first ever comprehensive reform of the Supreme Court appointment process, and he helped made it the most gender representative Supreme Court in the world. There is a list of areas and achievements that Irwin promoted as a Minister and Attorney General. One of them is Canada's first national justice initiative against racism and hate. As a leading parliamentarian on the global stage, he has been the chair of Interparliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran, the chair of Interparliamentary Group on Justice for Sergei Magnitsky, the chair of the all-party Save Darfur Parliamentary Coalition, the Canadian Action of the Parliamentarians for Global Action, and a member of its International Council. More than that, I had the pleasure of working with Professor Cotler on a number of dissident-related issues. He has always been the first to take lead, to charge, to write, to pursue justice, and to promote human rights. And Irwin, you can come and join us here in the center. And let me also introduce the person who's going to manage this conversation, Dr. Ronen Hoffman, scholar, gentleman, and also a friend. Dr. Hoffman is an Israeli academic, a politician, and a diplomat. He served as a member of Knesset for the Yesh Atid party from 2013 to 2015. He also served as ambassador to Canada from 2021 to 2023. He was born up north in Israel in the city of Afula. He studied political science at Tel Aviv University. He worked at the Israeli consulate in Atlanta as a personal aide to Yitzhak Rabin during afterwards and in the 1992 elections. He was involved in coordinating the Israeli delegation to the peace talks with Syria from 92 to 94. In 97, he co-founded the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, later the Reichman University. He completed his doctorate at King's College in the Department of War Studies in 1999. Then he worked for many years as a lecturer at the IDC, focusing on foreign relations, diplomacy, and geopolitics. In 2012, he joined the Yesh Atid party and became a member of the 19th Knesset, a member of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee. And in 2021, he was appointed to the Ambassador of Canada. And today, amongst many other pursuits, he directs the Exploration, Leadership, and Innovative Program at Tel Aviv University. So Ronen, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Baums. Thank you, everyone, for organizing Dayan Center. And thank you very much, Professor Cotler, for the opportunity to have this conversation here with you. I would like to start, with your permission, by getting a better understanding of that very important role, which is a special envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. It's, for me, not only as a citizen of Israel, but when I served in Canada, I was witnessing the important work that you're doing and that you're leading in Canada and around the world. And I wonder if there is any specific structured or defined mandate to the role of special envoy. If we can please share with us what does it mean and what is this role kind of all about.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to begin by just expressing kind of humbleness to the introduction by Nir. We've had the chance to work together, so look at it at the extravagance of a friendship rather than an objective introduction. With regard to Ronen Hoffman, here I can say as an expert witness, when he was ambassador to Canada, he was an exemplary ambassador for the state of Israel, and regret that he's no longer in that diplomatic capacity, but the students and Tel Aviv University are the beneficiary of his talents. And that's the other thing I wanted to mention. My son, who's very much a critic, was a student of Ronen Hoffman, and I can say publicly what he is. I've told him he thought Ronen Hoffman was the best teacher he had when he was doing his graduate degree at Reichman University. So I want to thank you for that, Ronen, because he's also living here in Israel, Aliyah. I think your tutorship was very important for his integration and his Aliyah here as well. Now it's to your specific question about the mandate. The mandate that I had in Canada, I was Canada's first special envoy. It's a joint mandate of preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. But it's really 8 intersecting mandates, and very quickly. It's preserving Holocaust remembrance domestically and internationally. That's 2. It's combating anti-Semitism domestically and internationally. It's heading up the Canadian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whose 25th anniversary we will be commemorating in a few days, actually, here at the Swedish Embassy, where it all began in Stockholm. And it's also a special envoy to in the international arena, Organization of American States, European Union, and the like, and working with counterpart envoys there. And then the final 2 dimensions of the mandate are representing Canadian jury to the Canadian government and society, the government, parliament, civil society, and the like, and the reverse, representing the Canadian government, parliament, civil society, back to the Jewish community and developing allyship and the like. So those are the 8 intersecting mandates. The Canadian special envoy is distinguishable in that sense because most other countries have a country envoy, and that's it, and either domestic or international, and that's it. This one has the integrated responsibilities as I've just outlined, but it does allow whoever has that responsibility to thereby get a global perspective, an integrated and interactive perspective, and it helps therefore to not only understand the mandate, but to better discharge the responsibilities.
Thank you so much for sharing. Professor Cotler, let's speak a little bit about before and after October 7th, in terms of anti-Semitism and hate and all that. You know that on October 7th, everyone was shocked, but in a way, I spoke with friends, colleagues, family members, and we sensed that with all the horrible thing that's happening, maybe in that momentum when the world was exposed to the atrocities and the horrific terror attack and killing, raping, all that, that maybe there is a momentum to feel more empathy, more even support towards Israel and towards the Jewish people. And actually what happened was exactly the opposite. It was an explosion of anti-Semitism and hate. How would you explain that, and how do you see that?
Well, when I'm in Israel, and I happen to have been in Israel on October 7th, when the horror is too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened to occurred. And then, of course, I was then afterwards back in Canada, and when I look back and whenever I'm in Israel, Israel is still experiencing October 7th. In the international community, it has not only moved on, but in fact, as you mentioned, we've had an explosion of anti-Semitism. So we meet in the painful shadow of October 7th, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. A day characterized as the worst day in Jewish history, since the Holocaust, of mass atrocities, not only the mass murder and mass rape, maiming and mutilation, but burning and beheading children, elderly, women, disabled, Holocaust survivors, and the like. And I've been down to the south. I've been visiting with kibbutzim, and the Rao Wallenberg Center, which I chair, represents close to 100 of the families of the hostages. So we're very much engaged in that issue. And for me, the hostages remain a looking glass into the horrors of October 7th. And every day that the hostages are in captivity is not only a crime against humanity, but knowing Hamas is a day of torture for those in that captivity. And again, in looking back on October 7th, and since the mass atrocities committed by Hamas were not just being committed by what is a terrorist statelet, but an anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist statelet. Not because I say so, but because Hamas has said so, and so affirmed in its charter in 1988 to the present. So they've been involved in a public and standing incitement to genocide since 1988, which people may not realize is a standalone breach of the Genocide Convention, as the Supreme Court of Canada has held. Whether or not any mass atrocities would follow, or genocidal acts, the very incitement to genocide is a breach of the Genocide Convention. And that breach imposes a responsibility on all state parties to prevent and punish. But of course, Hamas was never prevented nor punished for that standing breach of the Genocide Convention. One would have thought, therefore, that these mass horrors by such a genocidal anti-Semitic organization would have led to a mitigation of anti-Semitism, to a combating of anti-Semitism. But it was, you mentioned, the exact reverse. It was an unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism. And not only an unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism, that also has been accompanied by even denials that the horrors even took place, or by others supporting the horrors that took place, or where you see now in the campus culture in the U.S. and Canada and Europe, even not only support but justification that this was in fact part of a legitimate resistance by this terrorist state, which all of a sudden turns into a heroic resistance organization. And even in some instances, by those who should be knowing better, a celebration of these atrocities. And so one has to ask oneself, how is it that all this has come about that way? And I think here, if I may, there's the first thing that one has to look at, and I'll just maybe go into other parts. First thing is one has to have an appreciation of the origins, the nature, the essence, and the impact of anti-Semitism. It's not only, as we always characterize it, as being the oldest, the longest, the most enduring, and the most lethal of hatreds, one which mutates and metastasizes over time. But it's grounded, it's anchored in one foundational, generic, historic, conspiratorial trope. And that is that of the Jews, the Jewish people, the Jewish state, Israel as a Jew among the nations, as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. Reflecting whatever is the zeitgeist, the cultural framework at any given moment in time. So when we were talking about the Christian religion, then the Jews were guilty of deicide. When it was the Middle Ages and the Black Plague, the Jews were the poisoners of the wells. When in the 1970s, and I was a law professor at the time, human rights emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something that I celebrated then as a professor of human rights law. What we weren't maybe paying attention to at the time was that Israel was being held out as a geopolitical antichrist of our time. And that has metastasized itself for the last 50 years. I say the last 50 years, 1975, you will recall, was the United Nations General Assembly resolution that Zionism is racism, which the then US Senator and Ambassador to the UN, Daniel Moynihan, said gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. We're seeing some of it now with regard to what's happening out of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. But it's what happened in 1974, a year before that, 50th anniversary of it now, that went unnoticed, unaddressed, and unredressed. Let me just sum up what happened in 1974. Israel was held out to be the enemy of labor. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labor Organization condemning, I could use the word alleged, but it wasn't, condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolution of the World Health Organization at the time condemning Israeli poisonings of Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem. I might add that in the last 2 years, Israel was held out to be the only violator of health rights in the world. Some of the alleged evidentiary data for what is happening in Gaza is coming from that same World Health Organization. So one has to question the objective character of that evidentiary data. The enemy of culture. Evidence, the resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of Palestinian historic sites in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The enemy of women. Evidence, the resolution then of the UN Commission on the Status of Women condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian women's rights. Might I add here again that in the last several years, Israel's been held out to be the only violator of women's rights in the world. The enemy of peace, a whole series of UN General Assembly resolutions to that effect, and finally, the enemy of human rights. Evidence, the resolution then of the UN Commission on Human Rights, now in its successor form as the UN Council on Human Rights, condemning Israeli violations of Palestinian rights. So to sum it up, Israel as the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, human rights. Israel is held out to be the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. That process has repeated itself annually for the last 50 years. So think of the generations that have been exposed to that. And I can tell you, as somebody who's sat as a member of the Canadian delegation to the UN, if you take a particular resolution, it's introduced in September. By the time the UN General Assembly adopts it, it's in December. You have a 3-month drumbeat of evil. The people sitting on these delegations come there uninformed, like tabula rasa, and members of the delegation can be diplomats, parliamentarians, journalists, academics, and the like. They listen to that drumbeat of evil, and they internalize it. And they can come there as innocents, and they come out believing that Israel is, as I said, a meta human rights violator. So that's a kind of backdrop that led us to where we are today.
And when we think about it, when we think about several organizations that try to combat it, in Canada, for example, the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal and even B'nai B'rith and others, and of course Wannenberg, that you're the head of. But sometimes I feel, and I felt it as an ambassador as well, that the organizations, sometimes they don't even speak to each other. So nevertheless, coordinating some kind of a strategy, a comprehensive strategy to deal with it, to combat it, to be together in a coalition, an alliance against it. How do you see that? Do you see anything in your horizon, any effective strategy or action plan that could actually combat it?
Yeah, I do believe that we need an action plan. Let me just take off where I left off. There were, in these last 50 years, several tipping points which relate to your question. And the first tipping point was the World Conference Against Racism and Hate in Durban, South Africa in 2001. And I was there as a member of the Canadian delegations. There were actually 3 parallel meetings. There was a governmental meeting or intergovernmental meeting. There was a NGO meeting, and there was a student gathering. But what happened at Durban was a World Conference Against Racism and Hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. And it was then that I mentioned Israel as being held out as a meta human rights violator. It was then that the labels and libel of Israel as an apartheid state began. Even though Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International published reports in 2021 with footnotes, etc., they were there at the time in Durban, and that's where it all began. And as I'm sitting here, and every time I talk about Durban, I can still see the marches in the streets. I can still hear the chants. I can still see the thousands saying that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against racism in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And that kind of thing was pervasive throughout the Durban conference. And I remember flying home from Durban to Montreal on September 10th, awakening on September 11th, as we all did, to 9/11. And then getting a call that day from a colleague of mine in South Africa who said to me that if Durban was, or if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, as she put it, then Durban was the Mein Kampf. And that was the framing. Those of us who were there, Durban indelibly implanted itself on our psyche. And let me just share with you what happened right after Durban, because this leads into your question. In the immediate aftermath of Durban, the UN General Assembly passed 20 resolutions condemnatory of one member state in the international region, happened to be Israel. 5 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. No resolutions against Iran or China or any of the major human rights violators. That was one thing. The UN Council on Human Rights met. A majority of its resolutions condemnatory of one member state happened to be Israel. At the University of Michigan, students got together, and that's where the BDS movement was born, again in the immediate aftermath of Durban, where at Michigan, a resolution proposing support for a two-state solution if Israel were to become a democratic state, already a problematic resolution, was defeated in favor of a resolution calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And finally, and this has gone completely unnoticed and unaddressed, the state parties to the Geneva Convention, the trustees, met for the first time since 1949, this is 2001, to put one state in the docket of the accused and criminalize it. One state, Israel. Not Russia, not China, not Syria and what was going on. One state. These state parties to the Geneva have met twice since then. And the only state they put in the docket of the accused, again, happened to be Israel. So this was the followed from Durban. Fast forward to 2021, when you had yet again a series of Hamas rocket attacks against Israel. I happened to have been here then. It started in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and then in 2021. Each time Israel ended up being condemned after the spate of rockets, and it responded. And then we get, of course, to what happened on October 7th as the final tipping point. And so we have to ask ourselves, you know, what then can be done, and what should our action be? If I may run in, I just want to just reference, I left it over there, the report that was just published on the eve of Yom HaShoah, a global report on anti-Semitism. And what I'd like to do is just summarize some of the findings which precede the action plan. And the findings were, I'll combine 2 parts. There are the findings that I have as having been a special envoy. My term concluded just before October 7th, at the end of September. And then came October 7th, and then come findings after October 7th. I'll try to combine them together for the reasons of time. The first thing that we found, I found this while I was special envoy, but afterwards, since October 7th, of course, it was explosive, is that already 2022 was the highest rate of anti-Semitic instances since data auditing began close to 50 years ago. So 2022 was the last year of the alarming rise before October 7th, and then there was this explosion since October 7th. So that in the months of post-October 7th to before, it went up in France 400%, in the United States 350%. I mean, it was alarming before October 7th. It exploded after October 7th. That's number one. Number two, which nobody paid much attention to, and that is anti-Semitic beliefs. the number of Americans who believe in 6 or more conspiratorial tropes doubled between 2019 and 2023. And so it's close to 20% of Americans believe 6 or more anti-Semitic tropes. So we're talking about millions of people that believe these conspiratorial tropes, whether it be the Jews control the media, et cetera, et cetera. A third thing we found was the phenomenon of globalization of anti-Semitism. By globalization, I don't only mean anti-Semitism across borders, yes, but what we found was the orchestrated character of the globalization. So, for example, using just 2021 as an example, at the time you had a convoy going through the streets of London, England, during the 2021 Hamas-Israel war, then saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters. The next day, the same convoy going through the streets of Toronto, saying the same thing, F the Jews will, in other words, orchestrated, not haphazard, not random. The fourth finding I would mention was what I would call the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism and hate. In other words, we have to combat all forms of racism and hate, be it racism and hate against indigenous people, blacks, people of color, Muslims, Asian, and the like. What I found when I became Special Envoy was that the call to action, the government's call to action to combat racism and hate against all these groups that I mentioned, did not include a call to action against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was erased, wasn't even there. And I found this throughout agencies and departments of government. We started to redress that when I became Special Envoy, but that phenomenon is still there and has to be, as I say, addressed and redressed. But not only the marginalization of anti-Semitism, we found also the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism. In other words, astonishingly, government agencies set up to combat racism and hate were actually funding anti-Semitic organizations of hate. And this too had to be redressed, and it is still an issue. But the fact that these kinds of dynamics were taking place, and it wasn't only in Canada, because I had this global responsibility, I saw this same dynamic elsewhere, which leads me to the next finding, and one of the more disturbing ones. And this really relates to what happened in Understanding October 7th, and goes back to what I said, what was going on 50 years ago. What I found was that the conventional paradigm that combating anti-Semitism, which you asked about, was we have to combat anti-Semitism from the far right, the far left, and radical Islam. That paradigm is still true, except that it is no longer just that three-pronged paradigm. What we found is that anti-Semitism was becoming increasingly mainstreamed, normalized, legitimated in the political culture, the popular culture, the entertainment culture, the sports culture, and in particular, the campus culture. And in my first report in 2021, I warned about what was happening and the metastasizing of anti-Semitism in the campus culture. And then we had another finding, the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. By that I mean, and I tried to share that with you, under the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the very struggle against racism, and I said apartheid itself, and we're witnessing that phenomenon as we meet right now. The International Court of Justice, there are two processes with respect to singling out Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment. There's the International Court of Justice that is engaged in accusations that Israel is responsible for genocide, morally and legally inverting what has been going on in terms of Israel, Hamas. And there's a UN General Assembly resolution seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice that's separate from the genocide one with regard to the illegality of the Israeli occupation and Israel as an apartheid state. So when I shared with you what goes on in the international arena and all these delegations, these are the kinds of things that have their pernicious followed. And then we have the arrest warrants that have been issued separately, as we speak now, by the International Criminal, the request for arrest warrants by the special prosecutor, which while he asked for arrest warrants re Hamas leaders, also is seeking arrest warrants regarding the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister of Israel. And I can tell you that the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights that I mentioned represents the families of hostages. We presented the special prosecutor in February in The Hague with a 1,400-page legal brief setting forth in detail the evidence re Hamas's war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, seeking arrest warrants against Hamas leaders. And at the time, the special prosecutor received our brief and commended the brief, and we believed that there would be these arrest warrants issued. And in fact, the requests have now been made for request warrants against Hamas leaders, but we never would have thought that it would have been paralleled with the request for arrest warrants regarding Israeli leaders. And as I said in public interviews over the last week, that this was creating a false moral equivalence between Hamas leadership and the leadership of a democratic state. In fact, the International Criminal Court statute, and I'm one of those who was involved initially with the establishment of the International Criminal Court, etc., and chaired the first ever parliamentary assembly for an International Criminal Court in 2002. The statute itself precludes, in effect, the investigation and prosecution of Israeli leaders because the statute says that the principle of complementarity, that is, if there's an independent judiciary in a democratic country like Israel, then the ICC is not supposed to substitute its investigation and judgment for that of the state of Israel and its judiciary. Yet, that is in fact what is happening now. And then I'll close with the last finding that we felt was disturbing, or the two last. One was the erosion of allyship. Those that we thought should be coming to our assistance, taking the horrific sexual violence as an example, we're silent. We're not there. We're indifferent. The UN group of women, I can go on and on. The human rights allies that one would have thought would have expressed outrage at October 7th were not to be found. Indifferent, absent, or even worse at sometimes, as I said, supportive. And that final finding is that anti-Semitism is not just threatening to Jews, which would be bad enough, but it's toxic to democracies. It's an assault on our common humanity. It's actually a threat to the national security of democracies, and we're seeing it now in the manner in which it is being played out. So it raises again, and I'm sorry to have taken this preface as to what then must be done, but the action requires an understanding of this backdrop. What were the findings? How does anti-Semitism play out, et cetera, et cetera. Just in one-liners, if I may, as to what has to be done. Number one, we need not only national action plans to combat anti-Semitism, but we need these action plans to be implemented and monitored. And when I say national action plans to combat anti-Semitism, Canada, for several years now, has been speaking about a national action plan to combat hate. And as I've said, and I said this as Special Envoy, that's not good enough. We do need a national action plan to combat hate for the reasons I mentioned, because there are other groups that are targeted as minorities as well. But anti-Semitism, in the manner in which it is exploded and is unprecedented, requires a distinguishable action plan for that distinguishable form of historic and enduring and lethal hate. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which is needed at this point, is for governments and parliaments and the like to adopt and implement the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on anti-Semitism. If you can't identify it, if you can't recognize it, you won't be able to combat it effectively. And when I say this, I have to tell you that Israel itself is failing and not adopting the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It's hard to go and ask other countries to do it, and then they turn back and they say, well, you know, Israel hasn't adopted it. There isn't a university in this country that has adopted the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. We're now working on it here. The ones that have adopted it in the States, and there too not as much, have to also work to implement it. And it brings me to the third point here. There are parliamentary precedents and principles that have adopted the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It was adopted, for example, in the Ottawa Conference, an Interparliamentary Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism in 2010. There's an Ottawa Protocol to that effect. And so we have parliamentary principles and precedents in that regard. With regard to hate crimes, I didn't mention in my findings, I should have shared this, we've had an explosion in hate crimes. But the hate crimes that have exploded generally have exploded specifically with regard to Jews. In Canada, for example, Jews are 1% of the population of Canada, yet they are the targets of close to 70% of the hate crimes. And so you see when I say why it's disproportionate and singled out and specifically targeted. And so one of the action plans here is one organized around what I call the 4 Ps for combating hate crimes. And that is the prevention of the crimes to begin with, the protection of the victims, the prosecution of the perpetrators, and the partnerships between various levels of government. And it's not only hate crimes, it's the incendiary hate speech on the internet, which is another finding that we had, the explosive character of the hate on the social media, which specifically targets Jews 10 times more than all the other minorities combined. And so here too, we need a combination of the role of parliament and government and social media companies that need to be held accountable, etc. And I'm delighted there's an interparliamentary group now to combat hate on the internet. But thus far, the implementation of an action plan has not yet been brought to bear. And finally, I will say that countries like Canada, which speak as they do about the importance of human rights and the importance of protecting democracy, must realize that anti-Semitism, as I said, is toxic to democracies, is an assault on human rights, and therefore in our foreign policy, in our human rights, both domestically, we need to combat anti-Semitism as a priority in developing our human rights policies, in our protection of democracy policies, lest we find anti-Semitism undermining the democracy and undermining human rights. So those are the outline of findings and the outline of actions, Ronan.
Professor Cotler, I would like to thank you so much for the conversation, for everything, for your leadership, for everything you're doing for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people, and for humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. Thank you, Dr. Ronan Hoffman, for that stimulating conversation. Nir Bohms will introduce our next speaker. The next topic on our program is Jews in Israel in the Arab and Muslim world, challenges and opportunities. And before Nir introduces our next speaker, I just wanted to point out that it wouldn't be right to discuss the topic of Jews in Israel and the Arab Muslim world without mentioning our dear colleague Esti Webman, Zichrona Livracha. And we'll have a lot more to say about Esti tomorrow during the full program in Hebrew, but I just wanted to say that as a leading scholar of this topic, pioneering, trailblazing, path-breaking, you name your superlative, I thought it necessary to mention her, and I'm sure Professor Parat will have much more to say on that issue as well.
Brandon, thank you very much. I think it's almost impossible to say thank you for Professor Cotler beforehand on not just stimulating, but also to some degree very worrying comments. And we are now moving to the next panel that looking at anti-Semitism in the Arab and the Muslim world, no less a challenging issue. I'm very happy to invite Carol Uriya, who's the director of the ADL senior, the director of the ADL Middle East and North Africa here in Israel. Carol began her career as a senior Middle East researcher and has over 25 years of experience in research and activities related to Middle East. She served as an Israeli Defense Force Intelligence Course, and following that, she worked for the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, the Foreign Ministry, and the Shalem Center. She holds a BA in Arabic Language and Literature from the Hebrew University, an MA in Arabic Language and Literature, specializing in Classic Arabic. And as a part of her role in the Anti-Defamation League, she engages in the struggle against anti-Semitism and delegitimization of Israel, promoting social cohesion in Israel, and combating hatred in the public space and online. And I will also would like to invite another dear friend, Roy Keys, a correspondent for Middle East affairs, a journalist, and now Katavenu in Kan Broadcasting Service, a partner and also a graduate of Tel Aviv University, who every time when there is an affair in the Arab world is one of the first people who engages and is there on tasks. So if you can take your seats over here, and Carol and Roy, the microphone is yours.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Carl, for the invitation. Thank you, your audience. So first of all, our panel is titled Jews and Israel in the Arab and Muslim world. And it mentions Jews and Israel in the same brief. And perhaps the good point to start with, Carol, is by asking, is there a really distinction between the Judaism and the Zionism in the Arab and the Muslim world? In other words, when you criticize Judaism, you also criticize Zionism?
So thank you so much, Roy, and it's a pleasure to be here in that distinguished company, and I feel that this is a sort of an intimate setting, so I feel very comfortable talking to all of you. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Cotler. It's always a pleasure to listen to what you have to say, and I'd like to relate to something that you said at the end. But first and foremost, it was. Oh, you're right. Yeah, it's not very enjoyable these days. I agree, Dina, and you know, Dina, we've had so many moments with Esti, you of course, but me too. When early on in my career that you described. Neil, I learned so much from Esti, and she was not only a great scholar and an important scholar who dealt with anti-Semitism in the Middle East, but also a very, very credible, honest, open, flexible, open-minded. So she was a treasure, and and also an amazing human being. So it's just an honor to sit in a panel that opened with Brandon mentioning Esti. To your question, Louis. So I think it's important to say that when first of all, for the sake of that panel, I think that when we speak about the Arab world, it's important to say that the Arab world is not a monolithic unit. When we say the Arab world, we assume that the Arab world has the same perception, has the same view, has the same beliefs about Jews, and that is not a case at all. There are a lot of different perceptions of Jews, divided not only by countries, but even by cities and by areas and by tribes and so on. So it's important to have a nuanced conversation on the Arab world when we talk about that. But still, if we need to talk about Zionism, Judaism, Israelism in the Arab world, I would say that first of all, we've seen a huge change in the last couple of years that is, I don't know if we should describe it as a positive change, but there's a shift. Whereas, 20 years ago, we would talk about, clear anti-Semitism in a very classical format in the Arab world. And things have changed. And things have changed in the last 20 years for a couple of reasons. So the first and foremost, I would say that the mega change took place during the Arab Spring, where a lot of the criticism that used to be towards Israel as a cathartic element started to be directed internally to their own societies, as sort of a soul-searching that was much needed in the Arab world. And in a way, the Jews and Israel, were forgotten to some extent, if I can put it that way. That's generally speaking. But things happened even after. And with the understanding of many moderate Arab countries that Iran poses a danger not only to Israel, but to themselves, something happened also in the perception of not only Israelis, but of Jews. And it really helped, and we're seeing less, I would say a little bit more tolerance towards Israelis and Jews. Now, with regards to Zionists, this is something that we're seeing a lot in the media, and we're seeing in the popular culture. But for example, and I guess that Arik will be able to attest to that, in the education system, we're seeing more the use of Jews rather than Zionists and Israelis. So that, first of all, that I would say is easier to relate to. The second is that I think that when we, when the word Jew and Zionist become identical, it makes it easier to delegitimize Zionism and by proxy Jews, because we don't hate Jews, right? We just hate the Jewish state. And we hate those who live in the Jewish state with the belief about the Jewish state. So it's a very, very complicated. Let me just mention one last point, which is, and I want to give an example, not from the Arab world, but from the West. But it relates somehow to the Arab world. So on October 6th, when the organization on campus, Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the the organization that has the most chapters on U.S. universities, when they related to Israel, they simply call it Israel. October 8th, I'm talking a day after. We didn't even know what was happening here in Israel. We haven't yet figured out what the damage is. But they started to relate to Israel in all of their correspondence as the Zionist entity. And by the way, talking about terminology, not only the kibbutzim, but the armed settlements. And not only not normalizing relationship with Jews, but really a real confrontation. So terminology has changed, and the word Zionist have become more, accepted and used, and the rest on campus is not history. It's current actual affairs.
We spoke about change, and I think one of the most change relating Jews and Israel in the Arab world is connected to the education of the Holocaust, the image of Israelis and Jews in the Holocaust. Holocaust education, we must say, was for a long time a taboo in the Arab world and was plagued with Holocaust denial. Just recently, for example, Al Jazeera, the Qatarian network, posted the phrase in the website, the alleged Holocaust.
Oh,
so what do you think are the prospects of including Holocaust education anywhere in the Arab world? We must say we see it happening, but we want more. We need more.
Thank you for that question, Roy. This is an important one, and I think that we live under the perception, which is probably true, but not. I would not rely only on that. That Holocaust education is a very important component in countering anti-Semitism, which it is. But I still, with some reservation, would like to also mention that sometimes there are countries that mandate Holocaust education and there's still high levels of anti-Semitism. So it's not the full and complete antidote to anti-Semitism. Second, in terms of just to lay the ground for that conversation, Holocaust denial, which we're seeing in the Arab world, is anti-Semitism. When you look at the Arab definitions, it's very clear that Holocaust denial, denying the Holocaust, fully denying, partially denying, is anti-Semitism. So when we see that in the Arab world, it has to make us think of where all of it is coming from. However, and while we understand that this is not the only solution to anti-Semitism, learning about the Holocaust is a very important component in understanding human history, Jewish history, and understanding the psyche of Jews and Israelis, because a lot of the way we think is based on our experience with the Holocaust. So I think that, we know that there are places in the Arab world where the Holocaust has started to be taught, like in the UAE, for example, and obviously in Morocco for many, many years. But I think that we can also, based on some research, but also based on some instinct that we have, or I have, for example, from visiting those countries, it comes also with more tolerance towards Israelis and towards Jews, because that understanding contributes to softening the image of Jews in Israel and understanding where Jews are coming from. I will tell you that right after the Abraham Accords, as I guess most Jewish groups, we wanted to get a sense of what they know, what they don't know about the Holocaust, and we held some sessions with some targeted groups in the United Arab Emirates. And I have to tell you that the level of interest, not only the interest to know, but also understand that the psychology of it. We had a Holocaust survivor talking to them, and I was amazed, not only by the interest, but also by the level of compassion and the level of wanting to engage on that issue that I did not expect when we aim to do those sessions. So they're really, really good signs. I also want to mention one more thing, which is on a policy level. I think it was 2 years ago at the UN, Egypt adopted a resolution that is condemning Holocaust denial. And in that respect, these are the things that we should really embrace. It's a surprise. Israelis don't know about that. And Israelis and Egyptians are not, the best friends on a people-to-people level. But it's very important to know that as a policy, the country that is, neighboring to us in the south has adopted a resolution that helps us to fight anti-Semitism in the Arab world. And that should be, top news in Israel when it happens.
You mentioned the Abraham Accords, the normalization accords between Israel and the Arab countries in the recent years. And I want to ask you, what do you think the effect of these accords regarding the image of the Israelis and Jews, and especially after the attack on 7th October?
When I grew up, and I'm a little bit older than you, Roy, we spoke about that. When I grew up in the 70s, my parents came from Morocco. When I grew up, they didn't know one word in Hebrew, so we spoke in French. And in any event, we came with a very sort of like Moroccan culture. And when my parents came to Israel, after living with Moroccans, with Muslims, they didn't know what to make of the conflict. So this is the way I was raised. And one of the things that stayed with me along my childhood is this notion of, wait, we live here, but we cannot go to countries around us. We cannot visit. And I think that for somebody like me...
It's a big gap. It's a big gap.
It's huge.
Also, I speak as a journalist who covered this region.
So one of the things that I grew up with, to be honest, is first of all, such a passion to the Arabic language. My grandmother spoke, both of them spoke Arabic. They didn't speak French, so the communication between them and my parents were not at the highest level, and I wanted to communicate with them, so I studied Arabic. And this came also with such, such a dream to visit Arab countries. For me, visiting Egypt, visiting Jordan, these were the highlights of my life. And it stopped like 94 with the peace treaty with Jordan, the normalization treaty with Jordan. Sort of we got stuck in that level. And when we had the Abraham Accord, I cannot even tell you what it, for people like me, it was really a dream come true. I do want to say that, Jews, and now it's not only me, because I'm part of this conversation, part of this ecosystem, speaking Arabic, knowing the culture and so on. But other Israelis never have had encounters, positive encounters with Arabic-speaking audiences from the Arab world who are not Israeli Arabs. They never had those encounters. So you asked me about the perceptions of Jews. I want to start by the perceptions of Arabs that Israelis had. That really opened an opportunity for Israelis to visit those countries and see that the hostility that they attribute to hearing a conversation in Arabic was something that can be changed. So that's on that level. Second, in terms of seeing Israelis in Arab countries, I really think that stereotypes that have been cultivated on Jews and Israelis in those countries have reduced, and I've seen some research, but not, to be very honest, not a comprehensive poll, and I think it's probably needed to see how the image of Jews and Israelis have changed in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Morocco. But from encounters that I have, first of all, I think that when you go to a country like Morocco, it is one of the safest, maybe not these days, but before that, one of the safest places for Jews in the world, even if you compare that to other Jewish communities in the West. Jews walk in Morocco freely with kippot, talit, whatever. Their worshipping rituals and so on are so well respected. So I think in that respect, we get exposed to how they treat us even before we were allowed to go in. And finally, I think that it's also a matter of interest. We're talking about normalization, and normalization with Israel goes beyond Jews and Israelis. Those countries understood that the way to de-radicalize their societies and prevent the extremism, the wave of extremism coming from Iran, also goes through a country like Israel, and by proxy, create a more tolerant atmosphere towards Jews and Israelis. So all in all, I think it pays off in many respects, but definitely in terms of the perception of Jews and Israelis.
And the effect of the war in Gaza?
Well,
because like you said about Morocco, in other countries we see demonstrations against Israel, against the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, we see demonstration. I would say that there's not one answer to all, because I think that in each and every country it has its own characteristics. So in Morocco, Morocco is a country where most of the society gets their information from Al Jazeera, and when they see something like the alleged Holocaust, then this is what they see, this is what they're exposed to, and this is the narrative. So it affects the public opinion, and obviously there are some political reasons that lead the regime in Morocco to allow those demonstrations as a sort of a cathartic element. Bahrain is a different story. I mean, we've seen mass demonstrations in Bahrain as well. Bahrain is a country with a majority of Shiite population. And there too, there are some sentiments that are being allowed outside, in the streets, that I'm not sure that the government shares. I think that they have a totally different sentiment. I think that, when you look at the Arab world, there are two parallel trends. So as I said, there's an understanding that the public opinion is sort of like, first of all, needs to be out, as in is not in favor of Israel, to put it mildly. But there's also an understanding in the realpolitik that the relationship are not going to be disconnected, not even downgraded, as we're seeing in other countries. And I think in that respect, this is an encouraging sign. Hope that it will continue like that.
So you're optimistic?
Always? Always.
Let's focus more closely on the Jewish communities in the Arab and Muslim countries, from whom this distinction between Jews and Israel, it's a matter of life or death. For example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, do you think a time will come in which Jewish life in the Arab and Muslim world countries will be no longer require distinction between Judaism and Zionism? I know, tough question.
Yeah. I believe that we can get there, but we're not there yet. Obviously, a country like Iran, I just want to make sure that we all understand is an extreme case study.
Yeah.
And while we hear that the Jewish community is protected, mainly the Jewish community in Tehran, which is probably the case, I don't know how much we can trust all of the information that we're getting, even from them, and obviously from what we're seeing in the media. So that's one. Second, it's clear that in a country with such an extreme regime like Iran, that not that you can even get away with the distinction between Jews and Zionists. When you're a Zionist, you're entitled to one punishment. It just cannot be there. Yeah. So Zionism is is probably something that you cannot really identify as a Zionist in Iran. If that is going to change, maybe the supreme leader is very old, and maybe in 3-4 years we're going to see a change, and that can change the situation, but not for now. Just one word about the other communities. So first of all, I spoke about the Jewish community in Morocco, that where I don't think that Zionism is, such a big no. It's not, but it's also not out there.
Yeah.
But the respect to Jews is obviously at the highest level, we can even expect. And in other communities, like the community in Bahrain, in a good day, 40 people, I think that, low profile is the MO of that community, and probably for their own reasons.
Great. Leslie, but we need to be short because So what is the role of the Israeli Arab in this equation?
Israeli Arabs are, I think that there are two main points to mention here. First of all, Israeli Arabs are a bridge, and this is the way we should look at them. They're a bridge to people that have similar cultures and speak a similar language, and in that respect, I think it's important to develop relationship, to maintain relationship, and to keep them, as part of the Israeli society, which is not always the case. The second point about the Arab society in Israel is that for better or for worse, they are a sort of the way we treat them is a litmus test to how Israel behaves, generally speaking, to minorities. I was last week in the city of Rahat, and then on the weekend I visited the village, the Druze village of Khorfesh, and you see there, it was interesting. I was in a week of a lot of meetings with officials and so on. The level of optimism that you see in those communities is much higher, post-October 7th, is much higher than the general sentiment in the Jewish society in Israel. So I think that, first of all, we have what to learn from them a little bit. And then the better relationship that we have with them, first of all, it's for the benefit of the Israeli society, but also it shows our allies in Arab countries that there's a sort of a joint sentiment of respect to all Arabic-speaking cultures, societies, and countries.
So with this optimistic spirit, we will finish.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Carol and Uriya. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Rui. The next topic on our agenda is textbooks as political predictors, shifting narratives on Jews and Israel in regional curricula.
Education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. And this is the words of Nelson Mandela, and probably a good opening for this short panel. I'll just add, and Carol, to use the opportunity to thank you again, that I had the pleasure of taking a very interesting group from Morocco, from the Gulf, and for the first time from Pakistan to the March of the Living just a few weeks ago. The third group from the Arab world that I had the chance of taking, and in the Zoom we had with them just a few days ago, a very interesting exchange on October 7, on Zionism, and at least I would say I can join with a little note on optimism, and hopefully Arik Agassi, who's going to spend a few minutes with us dealing with the issue of textbooks, can perhaps add a segment of optimism as well. Eric is the head of Global Partnership for Impact SC, the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, one of the longest but yet most precise names of NGOs that you can find here. The organization works on studying textbooks and particularly in their relations to tolerance and the acceptance of the other. And Eric, I think, will tell us a little bit about some of the most recent findings. Eric has a BA in Government and Diplomacy and an MA in Middle East Studies from Tel Aviv University. He has been working as the head of external affairs and operations for the Israel Project and also at the Israeli Parliament at the Knesset, along with member of Knesset Einat Wilf. Eric, you can come join us here. And I think the PowerPoint is loading.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Inbal, for the invitation. It's good to be here as a former student and now also seeing former professors and colleagues. It's an honor. I also want to recognize, and I hope I won't cause any ineimut, but I want to recognize my uncle Dov Nisman, who's a former Olympian, 1976 Olympics in Montreal for swimming. He's also a world champion for seniors, by the way, pretty recently. I just had to say that. So, textbooks. I've been working at this institute for the last 8 years now, since 2016, primarily with policymakers in Europe, North America, but also the Middle East, to help identify where issues and objectionable content appears in school textbooks to try to trigger changes. And I hope to bring some positive news. I will end with a little negative, but at least bring some positive news to this discussion, and perhaps some people are not that aware of what's going on in the region in terms of education. So why textbooks? First of all, textbooks are sometimes the first means of communication that children ever see. Way before a smartphone, way before they know how to operate a mouse, way before they go on Facebook, they see a textbook in school or at home with their family. And especially in the Arab world, textbooks are extremely authoritative. more than the Western world. Usually they have the seal of the state on it, usually the picture of the leader, and textbooks keep going throughout time, at least 12 years if they reach grade 12. All the time they see the same thing, and they're extremely authoritative and very powerful to convey messages, ideologies. And I always say to people, if you really want to know what a leader is looking for his next generation, don't look at what he told his local media, look at what's in the textbooks, because that is exactly where you can see where leaders want to take their societies. Again, they have a consistent message, and they're taken and written by the state, essentially, in many times, especially in the Arab world, and therefore, what you see in the textbooks many times can be what you will see in the future. And therefore, some of these changes that I'm going to show in a second, and I don't have too much time to discuss all the countries that we've worked with and working in, but there's a lot, so I think it'd be interesting to deep dive into it a little bit. So textbooks are extremely powerful. Two examples are the Nazis and ISIS, who understood from a very early from very early on when they came to power that if they want to have and shape the next generation to be subordinate to them, they need to change the education. So we can see here images on top of Nazi textbooks. The Nazis weren't that long in power in terms of to reshape a generation, but immediately they've changed textbooks. We see here in the middle image a book where a child, you can't really see it over here, but there is the number 6 on the chalkboard, which is shaped like a long Jewish nose, and they're told about that. There's a math problem over here, and I'm deliberately giving you some of these examples because you're going to see similar examples in some of these other countries in the Middle East. But this is a math example in the Nazi era where they instructed students to calculate how much the state needs to spend on taking care of the disabled. Because if you know, as you know, the Nazis were trying to eliminate also disabled because it was a burden on the state. So they even used that in a math example to teach math on how much does it cost to the state to take care of all these people. Why? To insert this political message to the young generation, even through science and math. ISIS did the exact same thing. One of the first things they did, really a lot, sometimes even before use of arms and things like that, is change the textbooks, even in English. So to study letters, they use letters that start with weapons and things like that. There's also in grammar and language images end with AK-47s and anti-tank missiles and things like that. So you can understand that leaders in this region really know that textbooks are important, sometimes more important than social media if they want to control society. So in the Middle East, we really try, and we're trying to develop something called CISA, which is a curriculum-informed strategic assessment, where we're trying to use textbooks as a methodology to predict. Now, it's not the only thing. It has a lot of caveats, and it's not complete, but you can definitely use textbooks as a tool to complement other research to kind of see what trajectory a society is going. And in the Middle East, there's actually extremely positive changes happening in most of the region. And let's speak a little bit about that. So before we deep dive a little bit into specific examples, part of the reasons that these changes are happening and when they happened, Carol also spoke about this before, September 11th, people tried to understand how come I think 90% of the terrorists were Saudi. What's going on? What did they learn, or why were so many Saudis involved in September 11th? Then people started looking at the textbooks. Same thing in the Arab Spring. Leaders try to understand why their regimes are being destabilized. And throughout history, the Muslim Brotherhood many times, in terms of the shifting and balance of power within these regimes, decided to demand the ministries of education to kind of control the education system, to try to work from within to destabilize some of these countries. And the leaders of the countries we're going to mention in a second understood that. And the Arab Spring really helped them understand what change they need to do to not have their regimes get toppled down. The rise of the Islamic State also was a trigger for some of these reforms. And I'll get some examples of what leaders in these countries did within ministries of education to change that. So I'm going to start with close by, Egypt and Jordan, and then move a bit elsewhere in the region. There's not enough time to look at all the countries. We've also looked at Turkey, we looked at Iran, we looked at Indonesia. But I want to focus it a little bit more in things that are more into the news and close to our borders. So Egypt announced in 2018 a full reform to rewrite from scratch its entire curriculum, all grades, all subjects. Our issue with this was that they are doing one grade per year and reprinting the older grades that they did not reform yet with all the hate. But we're now at 2013. They're done with grades 1 to 6. And what we've seen in these grades 1 to 6 that are completely new, including this September, was a complete elimination of all the anti-Semitism that was in, including toning down anti-Israel material. And I want to give you an example so you understand what I mean by that. The example on the top was actually from religious studies. And you see Islamic education for 5th grade. And you're wondering, why would Islamic education, a religious book in 5th grade, have an image of 1973 and the Suez Canal and the war? And the reason was that the textbooks at the time, and this was taught up to 2022, connected the Jewish characteristics of ancient Islam in Islamic education, meaning their relations with Muhammad and the battles with Muhammad, and how Jews as a collective, not a single group or tribe, but as a collective, betrayed the Prophet and were liars and fraudsters and traitors. They basically connected that with Israel of today in a religious textbook. So they made this connection between religion and the conflict, even though the conflict with Egypt was territorial. It wasn't a religious by nature from the get-go. So they made that connection to say that the Jews of the past are, with the battles of Muhammad, are the Israelis of today, and we're basically Muslims protecting Muslim land. That was completely removed, and instead of that, on the bottom, the same exact textbook for the same grade, it was rewritten, so it wasn't just one example that was removed, but the examples at the bottom show inclusivity and quote specific scripts, Islamic scripts, both from the Hadith, which is the oral tendencies of Islamic nature, and then also from the Quran, to quote and interpret positive examples of how Muhammad treated the Jews, and not describing Jews as a collective, so more contextualizing. So if there was a battle between Jews and Muslims at the time, they named a specific tribe instead of saying the Jews as a whole, or just naming the name of the tribe without saying that it was Jewish. It's not really relevant information. For the first time, they included a picture of Begin, Sadat, and Carter at the White House lawn. They visualized the peace with Israel. It's pretty factual. There's no incitement in there. It obviously comes from an Egyptian perspective, as you would expect. But it is described in the textbook as a strategic asset to the national security of Egypt. And you can imagine how many kids, I think there's around 20 to 30 million kids at any given moment in school. So when a change like this happens, you can imagine how many kids are affected by this change for generations, as long as this is kept in. And at the Institute, what we do is try to show these problematic examples, and I can say work with people in the region that have some influence to bring some changes to what we've seen. And then we go back to the same textbooks and we assess this example last year. Has it been removed? Was it toned down? Was it replaced? Etc. So this is Egypt. Jordan is actually the opposite. We've seen a deterioration in the Jordanian curriculum. We've reviewed it now 2 times, in 2019 and 1 in 2022. And we're going to do another review pretty soon. And what we've seen in the Jordanian curriculum, this Roy case also published this, and this is where I saw it for the first time. They inserted a topic, a passage about October 7th, justifying October 7th. And if you think about the timing for a second, this is really important. Textbooks, they come out in September, at the beginning of the school year. October 7th happened after the beginning of the school year. So this was a textbook for the 2nd semester, and someone had to decide to edit the digital edition of this textbook before it went down to print pretty fast, to be able to print it in enough copies in time and distribute it to thousands of kids all across the kingdom. So it shows you where this kind of, this is one example, again, tip of the iceberg. We have reports of hundreds of examples from different topics, including gender and LGBTQ and different things. But it gives you an understanding of where this is going. The peace treaty with Jordan is not mentioned in the textbooks at all, except for one tiny mention, one cursory mention, where it's discussed as a by the way in a history textbook, where it speaks about the peace with the Israeli occupation state, when it was mentioned that the Hashemites, through the peace treaty with Israel, got custodianship over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So kind of even in a negative tone, what they've achieved. So other chapters show the full biography of King Hussein, nothing about the peace treaty with Israel, or him visiting members of Israeli families who their kids were murdered by a Jordanian soldier. I forget the year when he shot across the border, when he went across Israel to visit these families. All of that is completely ignored. So Jordan is going towards a negative trajectory, unfortunately. Obviously, you know, the social fabric is very different, just like it is in Bahrain and in other countries. But again, the king, and these are authoritarian regimes, they have the power to do this based on this balance of power that they have in the countries, and it's a matter of will. The UAE is head and shoulders above the rest in terms of how progressive and tolerant their textbooks are, and inclusive, not only about Israel and Jews, but about the other in general. We've reviewed their curriculum and found zero anti-Semitism, literally. And we usually find things because, you know, this is part of the fabric of the region. But what you need to know about the UAE, which is interesting, relates to what I said about the Muslim Brotherhood before in the Arab Spring. Sheikh Zayed, the leader of the UAE, understood, and he said this to the New York Times, not to us, that he has a problem. And he admitted that he basically fired and kicked out of the UAE many people who were involved in curriculum development in the Ministry of Education, and a lot of teachers that were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And after that, they did a full root and branch reform that took out many of the hostile examples and included amazing examples that I would really want my kid to study. It's really progressive. They announced, quoting our research, that they're going to include the Holocaust, so we see that as well, respect to Jews, teaching about the normalization with Israel. They actually gave it a religious justification. Remember, despite them seeing Israelis now, they're a very conservative society from a Muslim background. So one of the ways that the UAE tried to give justification to the normalization agreement was to give it religious justification. So they took a very prominent clerk who was very well accepted in the UAE and gave a quote from him in a religious justification on why this is good for Emirati society, why this is good for our country. And it actually appears in 3 separate textbooks. So that was a very encouraging development to see. Even the Israeli textbooks, I think, except for one case, still they didn't include yet that. It's a different system. Second editions take more time, unlike the Arab world where they do these reprints. But things that were removed, which are pretty obvious, a text that says that the Palestinian issue is the basis of all conflicts in the Middle East. Obviously, they're going to remove this. They removed this before normalizing peace with Israel. Again, these examples were before normalization. Why? Because they understood that if they want to have a society that can have economic relations with Westerners, with Jews, with other people, and not only be dependent on oil, then they can't have kids thinking that Jews have tails and horns or whatever. So they understood the power of that. Same thing, removal of some anti-Semitic scriptures, like that Zionism has some aspirations to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates River. This is also in many other countries, as if, you know, Israel's recognized borders are not enough for, and there's some secret plan to take over. This is in a lot of the textbooks that we've seen. Morocco is an amazing example. It's a bit different because it has a Jewish history, unlike the UAE. And it comes from the top. Mohammed VI, the king, decided to put a directive to change the textbooks, and he's inserted, again, not 1 or 2 textbooks, but across grades, across subjects, not just the simple erasures of content, but also inserting content about Jewish culture, Jewish history, specifically content challenging anti-Semitic tropes. So there's a passage in there, not here because there's not enough time for all these slides, but there's a passage that tells that Moroccan Jews are Moroccan patriots. Why was it so important for him to say that in the textbooks? Because the issue of dual loyalty is extremely problematic in the Arab world. If you're Jewish, then you're probably more loyal to Israel. And there's examples of poetry and diplomats and singers and cuisine all across with visual images as well. Here we have two examples. Again, this is not a history book or civics. This is to teach language. So a reading comprehension story teaches about the Sabbath table and about Muslim family being hosted by Jews with a kippah and a challah and speaking between each other and about the different foods that they had on the table, not even recognizing, the Muslim didn't recognize this Jewish dish that was there, and even Mimuna in Passover as well was discussed. After Passover, obviously a Moroccan tradition, so Muslim students are now adverse at Jewish culture. This was extremely positive to see. Again, it's different. It has a Jewish history. What's not in the textbooks is an explanation of why the population went down from 200,000 Jews to hardly any left, but at least children are visible to this, unlike other countries. I'm going to close a little bit with the Palestinian Authority, UNRWA, and Hamas. They all study from the same textbooks. People think that they have a different system. It's all the same textbooks. They've rewritten their curriculum in 2016 from scratch, all grades, all subjects. It became way worse. Two major things happened. They removed all the attempts to make peace with Israel, so this wasn't a great curriculum before, but at least children were visible and aware of these attempts by their leadership to make peace with this evil Zionist regime that occupies their land and kills their people. All of that was removed, so children today don't even know or are aware that their leadership tried to make peace with this evil entity. The other thing that happened was a larger insertion of anti-Semitic examples that are not related to the conflict, specific examples against Jews as a collective and against Jewish people, and even things that creeped into science and math. So we have reading comprehension to teach to glorify suicide bombings. A firebombing attack on a civilian bus was celebrated as a barbecue party. Dalal Mughrabi is celebrated and glorified as a role model for girls, not scientists or doctors or peacemakers. These are their role models. Martyrdom and jihad are the most important meanings of life. That's a quote. The anti-Semitic caricatures of holding a globe with the Star of David and even the American flag. Zionists or Jews control money, media, and politics. And it goes on even in science and math by teaching arithmetic by counting martyrs, or letters through the words shahid for the letter H, or hujum, attack, or even Newton's law through use of slingshots. So other countries understood the power of textbooks, so did the PA, so did Hamas, and so did UNRWA, and they understood that this could shape the next generation. And we've been saying this for years, mostly because the people who fund these textbooks are the international community, primarily European Union and European countries. And we've warned that on October 7th will happen, and unfortunately, that's exactly what did happen. And we see here an UNRWA teacher in a classroom. He was one of the kidnappers of Israelis. He was quoted by the IDF saying, "We have female hostages, they captured one." We, as an institute, we just Googled his name. We found him on Facebook in an UNRWA class. And at the bottom here, we see an image very, very recent. This is important. I'm almost done, Inbal. There is an UNRWA principal from a month ago in Rafah, in a school where had all the students come from all the regions who ran to Rafah. And this was actually published by Al Jazeera, and we looked at the pictures, and then again, we saw a map without Israel in this UNRWA school by this UNRWA principal. We saw the lesson that he was teaching, and he was teaching about a violent return to Israel, including images, and it's a bit hard to see here, but a fourth grade reading comprehension there shows a girl try to reach over the fence, which is exactly what Hamas did, or what they tried to do in October 7th and through all the riots before October 7th on the fence. They're basically saying that the right of return is not going to happen in a negotiation or a peaceful way, or it's a violent return, and this is taught literally 2 months ago. So if we want to really challenge what the next generation will look like, you can kill the last terrorists in Gaza. But if you don't deal with this education, you will get another version of it extremely, extremely soon. So basically, there's a lot. You can go on our website. There's many more countries. Most of the trend lines are positive. Some places are going the other direction. And like I said, if you really want to look at where society is going, you can look at textbooks. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me after this. Thank you.
Toda Arik. Thank you. Before we move to the last topic of the evening and Professor Porat, I don't want to save it to the end, so let me just say a few thank yous now. First of all, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the immense time and effort that Dr. Inbal Tal has invested in making this event possible. This is all of her work, and it's really hard to do it justice, so thank you, Inbal. I also want to acknowledge the immense contributions of the Dayan Center staff, Tal Shachar Sofer, Tali Tony Marco Dolberg, Mori Yitzchak Wittman, and Elena Kunznoff for all of your work in making this event happen. Thank you very much. The last topic of tonight is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism before and after October 7th. And our last speaker, Professor Dina Porat, and let me tell you, it's not an easy thing to introduce Professor Porat, whose contribution to the Academy is immense and almost beyond description. So let me take a stab at it and recognize I won't be doing justice to it. Professor Dina Porat is the founding head of the Keynote Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry. She served as head of the Department of Jewish History of the Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies and as the incumbent of the Alfred S. Slanner Chair in Anti-Semitism and Racism, all at Tel Aviv University. She served as the Yad Vashem Chief Historian between 2010 and 2021 and is now its academic advisor. Professor Porat was awarded prizes for most of her publications, was Tel Aviv University Faculty of Humanities Best Teacher in 2004, got the Raoul Wallenberg Medal in 2012, is on the 50 leading Israeli scholars list from 2013, on the 50 leading women in Israel list of Forbes in 2018, and was a visiting professor at Harvard, Columbia, New York, Venice, and Hebrew universities. She's tutored 30 MA students, 20 PhD students, and served as an expert on Israeli foreign ministry delegations to the UN World Conferences, and as an academic advisor of the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, now IHRA. Professor Porat, the floor is yours.
It's already evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the exaggerated introduction. You know that one day there was an evening in Bialik, the poet Bialik's home in Tel Aviv. And he forgot all about it and went out to Tel Aviv to have a look at the city. Then, came home, running home, but it was a bit late. They already started, and they were talking, and he, so as not to disturb anyone who was standing at the very last row listening, and then when he heard so many praises, he elbowed the person next to him and said, "Tell me, who are they speaking about?" Okay. Inbal, thank you so much for the effort. Thank you, Professor Cotler, for this tour de force lecture you gave us. Thank you, Carol. This conference is dedicated to the memory of our dear friend Esti. Professor Litvak will speak about her more tomorrow. But let me say, she was not only a very dear personal friend, and her loss is felt every day, but she was an example, an exemplary example of a researcher. Reading every source, reading the sources, reading them thoroughly, not letting an assistant read and give her some summary, reading everything. Thinking, analyzing, writing with responsibility. And she was one of the first to see positive voices in the Arab world that others fail to see because we have our general opinions. So it's really an academic and personal big loss. Now, my topic is the Eyal, what is called today the Eyal definition. Let me say in a few words, what does it mean, this Eyal definition? And then raise and present two suggestions that I think are necessary following the 7th of October. The Eyal definition is a name that is just for convenience. The full name is the Working Definition of Antisemitism. It has been adopted in 2005 by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and then it was re-adopted in 2016 after a few changes by the IRA. And IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, not a Jewish body. 34 countries are members today, and they gather every year, twice a year, to try to handle, indeed, memory of the Holocaust research, etc. And they adopted the former 2005. Where did this 2005 definition come from? It came following Durban, which Professor Cotler so emphatically emphasized as a milestone in the history, in the sad history of anti-Semitism. Durban opened the door to a new kind of anti-Semitism that was indeed labeled New Antisemitism. Since 2001 until today, we are, in the history of anti-Semitism, in a phase in a period called New Antisemitism. Because, in short, it is more in Muslim hands, more violent, more coming from the street, and more merging the Jewish communities with Israel, thus blurring the difference that was dealt with before and was thought about before between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Violence indeed was on the rise after this Durban conference. 2004, cases doubled than in 2003. 2004, the German government, which always feels responsible, had a big conference in which one of the decisions was, let's have a working definition of anti-Semitism. And a number of scholars, organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, gathered together and framed a definition. It is a short one page and a bit. It is not a philosophical matter, not trying to think what or to define. Who is an anti-Semite? What's the history of anti-Semitism? Certainly not who is a Jew. It is an outright short definition of anti-Semitism, a negative attitude in any way, and then come 11 examples, 7 about Jewish communities and Judaism in general, 4 about Israel, and this document, this short document, has been in use since 2005 as help in training officers, in how to deal with complaints, in monitoring anti-Semitism, in discussions about identity, self-definition, etc. It is a non-legally binding document, which means that you cannot come with it to court and say, listen, Mr. Judge, this was done to me, and according to the definition, this is anti-Semitic. Please give a verdict concerning punishment. No, it is a non-legally binding document, but it can help when you get with it to court, and the court is in a country where you have either, up to today, there are 18 countries with laws against anti-Semitism, which specify the term anti-Semitism, 25 countries that have a law against Holocaust denial, and there are many countries with laws against racism. And since there is a UN decision that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, you can come to court and argue that anti-Semitism is racism and thereby demand justice. Okay, up until today, more than 1,200 entities, governments, יותר מ-1,200, governments, universities, parliaments, sport clubs, municipalities, etc., all over worldwide have adopted this definition, and thereby they made a certain statement that they are part of the struggle against anti-Semitism, that they are ready to struggle for the Jewish people, but not only the Jewish people, it serves for many other purposes. I can tell you, for instance, that the Association of Football in Argentina, which is quite a strong association in Argentina, the football, of course, adopted it, but it doesn't even say Jews or anti-Semitism. It has been adopted as a means to fight racism within sport. Okay, so far so good, isn't it? But I believe that, and by the way, Irwin, if I may, the Israeli government did adopt. I was there. It was in 2019. Every year there is a meeting, a special meeting for the International Holocaust Memorial Day, which the UN declared in 2005, also a result of Durban. The Israeli government did adopt. But you are absolutely right that not one of the universities in Israel has adopted it, and I doubt if they ever will. Okay, what now? We are after 9/11, so much has changed, so anti-Semitism has become so much more extreme, violent, etc., verbally, physically. I would like to make, shortly, Inbal, don't worry, I would like to make two suggestions. One is that we call the present anti-Semitism, we call it no longer new anti-Semitism, as we did from Durban to today, but to call it, perhaps you will come up, one of you will come with a better name, but so far I think about post-October 7 anti-Semitism, because it is different, it's more, as we've said, more violent, more pernicious, more poisonous, more extreme than it has been before. So one suggestion is to acknowledge that we are in a different time and give it another name. The other suggestion is a bit more complicated, but I think it is right now the time to do it. And this is the following. The working definition, or the IRA definition, as you call it, as we said, for a short term, cannot be changed. Why? Not that it is a sacred document, but it is a result of efforts of many. And you know, until you get the agreement of many individuals, scholars, organizations to have a text, Gewalt, yeah? And now to change it, you have to ask all those who were part of it to change, whether do they agree how to change. It's a mess. I suggest not to change, but I suggest to add to a number of articles and a number of phrases in this definition stronger words, because the definition as it is, even if Durban was really a very difficult milestone. The definition as it is, as was worded after Durban, is not enough. And I can give you, I'd like to give you a number of examples. It says what anti-Semitism is, then there are a few sentences of explanation. Among them, one says, anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. This is definitely not enough. Today, Israelis and Jews, Jewish communities and Israel together as one entity are conceived as a cosmic evil, as a danger, as a threat, and not just blamed for anything that goes wrong. And I strongly suggest that we add to this sentence the words threat, danger, cosmic evil, etc., to be defined as, the use of which to be defined as anti-Semitism. Article 1, another example. Article 1 in the examples, first example says, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology, of an extremist view of religion is anti-Semitism. Aiding or justifying, again, is not enough today. There are clear voices saying, kill Jews on campuses. You know, of course, that according to the president of the university, it is dependent, context dependent. As you remember, it is context dependent. It is not context dependent. It is absolute anti-Semitism. And I think here this article should be, the words, stronger words should be added to it, that advocating, calling clearly and openly to kill Jews. In one of the demonstrations on one of the campuses in the United States, one was carrying a flag on his back, and on the flag it said, final solution. This should also absolutely be defined as anti-Semitism. Let me go on. A few articles, a few examples speak about the denial of the Holocaust. 5, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Not enough today. It is not enough today because what is being said is that we, Jews, Israel, Jewish communities, are using the Holocaust in order to blackmail and to get weapons and to be paid and to be understood as those who feel what they feel when they are attacked. And the 7th of October is the worst that happened to us since the Holocaust. So the Holocaust is back again on the table. And therefore there are laws. There are 25 countries, as we said, there are laws against Holocaust denial. Why? Because saying that the Holocaust is a Jewish invention is an incitement. It takes a national entity and say that, first of all, if we invented this, we are a bit sick in the head, but that this story was invented in order to blackmail and to extort whatever we can, and this is definitely a lie that can be punished by law. I think this definitely should be added. The last one, Inbal, don't worry, I have more, but 7, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination. This is anti-Semitism according to the former definition. Yofi. the right to self-determination. This is not what is being said today. The right to exist is being attacked today. The right to exist is what is being said today. And I would say that when you say that something, someone does not have a right to exist, either because they are Nazis, who certainly cannot exist, or Antichrist, the Nazis are the modern Antichrist, certainly cannot. When you say that, this is a potentially genocidal statement. Because if you don't have a right to exist, you should be out from existence. So, I could have gone on, but this is what I intend to do with Professor Cotler's encouragement, that to add new words, stronger words to the definition, and have it reaffirmed, re-adopted, and be a stronger tool in the struggle against anti-Semitism, that this is what we are trying to do, and who knows how much we will succeed. Thank you so much.